He ran half of Chicago, and he had never once waited for anything in his life. Evander Cross walked into Meridian Steakhouse at 9:47 on a Thursday night, the way a pressure front walks into a room. Not loudly, not with announcement, but with the kind of weight that made people instinctively straighten their backs and look for the exits. The maitre d' intercepted him at the door, trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Two of Cross's men peeled off to sweep the dining room. The third stationed himself by the entrance without being told. Cross did not glance around the room the way insecure men do, cataloguing threats and exits. He already knew them. He simply walked to table 14, his table, always his table, because the manager had quietly retired it from the regular reservation system 3 years ago, and sat down. The restaurant cleared by a third in less than 4 minutes. That was the thing about Evander Cross. He didn't cause scenes. Scenes caused themselves around him. Nora Finch had worked the back half of Meridian's dining room for 7 months, and she had a system. She kept her head down. She kept her orders clean. She kept her uniform pressed and her hair pinned so tight it gave her a headache by 9 o'clock, and she smiled exactly as much as was required of her, and not a degree more. She was invisible by design. It had taken her years to understand that invisibility was a skill, and she had practiced it until it was second nature. She was also, at this precise moment, the only server left on the floor. 2 of her colleagues had found urgent business in the kitchen. One had faked a dropped tray. Her manager, a spineless man named Garrett Sloan, who wore his authority like a costume 2 sizes too large, had materialized from the back room only long enough to make eye contact with Nora and then immediately look away, which was his version of asking her to handle it. She had stood at the service station for 15 seconds, doing the math. Table 14, Evander Cross. 2 bodyguards visible. Almost certainly one more near the door. She picked up a leather menu and walked over. "Good evening." She set the menu in front of him without flourish. "Can I start you with something from the bar?" Cross did not look up immediately. He was reading something on his phone, and he finished whatever sentence he was on before he lifted his eyes. It was the kind of deliberate pause that was meant to communicate a hierarchy, and Nora had seen it enough times in enough contexts. From shift managers, from difficult customers, from a former boyfriend who thought silence was the same as power, that it no longer impressed her. When he did look up, his gaze did what most men's did. It started at her face and then drifted, slow and clinical, taking a full accounting of her. The wide set of her shoulders, the curve of her waist, the considerable heft of her, all of it present and unhidden in her standard issue server's uniform. She had stopped being surprised by the audit. She had stopped being wounded by it too, mostly. What she had not expected was what came out of his mouth. "Tell me," Cross said, his voice the low, even register of a man who had never once needed to raise it. "Did they run out of waitresses and hire the banquet table?" The dining room, which had been producing the careful ambient noise of expensive silverware and low conversation, went very quiet. Nora felt the heat climb her neck. She was aware of it the way she was aware of everything. Cataloguing it, naming it, refusing to let it move her face. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to decide what she was going to say. "I'll give you a moment with the menu," she said. And she said it pleasantly, and she walked back to the service station. Her hands, hidden from the dining room by the edge of the service counter, were shaking. She did not shake for long. The thing about Nora Finch was that she had not always been a server at Meridian Steakhouse. She had, in another life, been a forensic accountant at a firm called Delvane and Associates, where she had spent 6 years untangling the financial architecture of men who believed their money was invisible. She was very good at seeing things that were supposed to be invisible. Numbers, mostly. But people, too. She had left Delvane under circumstances she didn't discuss at parties, which was fine because she didn't go to parties. She had taken this job because it paid in cash, and required no background check, and because her apartment was 12 blocks away, and she had told herself it was temporary, that had been 7 months ago. She looked at table 14 from across the room. Evander Cross had ordered a whiskey from one of his own men, apparently unwilling to wait for formal service. He was reading his phone again. His posture was the posture of a man who had never once considered that a room might not be organized for his comfort. Nora thought about what she knew about him, not much that couldn't be found in the Tribune archives. The Cross name was attached to 3 legitimate businesses: a logistics company, a commercial real estate firm, and a hospitality group that owned 4 restaurants in River North, one of which, it had always struck her as noteworthy, was a direct competitor to Meridian. The rest of what the Cross name was attached to existed in a different kind of ledger, the kind that didn't get filed with the county. She picked up her order pad. She walked back to table 14. "The ribeye," Cross said before she reached him, not looking up. "Medium, rare, no sides, and I'll need the table cleared of everything except the glass." "Of course." She began gathering the unnecessary place settings. "And the question I asked you at the bar, did you want anything while you wait, or are you content with what your associate brought you?" He looked at her then, a different kind of look this time, the kind that recalculated. "You're still standing there," he said. "You haven't answered the question." Something shifted at the edge of his jaw. Not quite amusement, not quite irritation, something that didn't have a clean name. "No," he said. "Nothing from the bar. Perfect." She finished clearing the table. "I'll have that out in about 15 minutes. If it's overcooked, I hope you'll let me know. And if it is," she looked at him directly, "then I'll bring you another one." That's how restaurants work. She walked away before he could respond. The ribeye came out at 12 minutes. It was not overcooked. Cross ate in silence, which was his preference, while his men maintained a loose perimeter that the remaining dining room guests pretended not to notice. Nora refilled his water glass once, without being asked, and checked the table at appropriate intervals, and did not hover. She had learned early that men like this, men who wore authority like a second skin, hated hovering even more than they hated inattention. It was during the 3rd pass that he spoke again. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was not phrased as a question. "I'm focused on my section," she said. "Would you like to hear the dessert menu?" "That's not an answer." "It's the answer to the question I'm prepared to have at work." She set down the dessert card without waiting for him to request it. "The chocolate tart is very good. The pastry chef trained in Lyon." Cross leaned back slightly, studying her in a way that was different from before, less dismissive, more deliberate, like a man revising an estimate. "You've got nerve," he said. "I'll give you that. Whether it's nerve or stupidity, I'm still deciding." Nora smiled, the particular smile she had developed for moments like this. Polite, impenetrable, utterly without warmth. Most decisions become clearer on a full stomach. "Good night, Mr. Cross." She walked to the next table. Behind her, she heard him make a short sound that might, in a different man, in different circumstances, have been a laugh. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. He came back the following Thursday. Same time, same table, same 2 men visible, one at the door. Nora was in the middle of running a dessert order when she heard the familiar temperature drop in the room and looked up and saw him. She finished the dessert order. She did not hurry over. She appeared at table 14 at a pace that communicated neither eagerness nor avoidance. "The ribeye again?" she asked. "Something different tonight." He was watching her in a way that felt less like appraisal and more like study. "What do you recommend?" She tilted her head slightly. In 7 months of serving the dinner crowd at Meridian, she had never once been asked what she recommended by a man who looked like he ate at tables more expensive than this one. "The duck," she said. "Chef Reyes does something with the cherry reduction that's worth the 20 minutes it takes. And if you're interested in starting with something, the burrata is made in-house." "The duck," he repeated. All right, and something from the bar. He looked at her steadily. Bourbon, neat, whatever you think. She brought him a glass of Pappy Van Winkle without comment, because she had learned to read the ledger of a room, and the ledger of this man read old money and older tastes, even if neither was technically accurate. He tasted it, looked at the glass, and said nothing, which was the closest thing to a compliment she expected from Evander Cross. He came back the next week, and the week after that. The fifth Thursday was the one that broke the pattern. He arrived later than usual, past 11, closer to closing, when the dining room had thinned to 2 other tables. He sat down without his usual composure entirely intact. There was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before, and the way he set his phone face down on the table had the particular controlled force of a man who had been grinding his back teeth since approximately 7 o'clock. Nora brought him bourbon without being asked. He looked at the glass. Don't, he said. She stopped. Don't what? Don't do that thing you do, where you preempt everything and make it look effortless. There was something raw at the edge of his voice, buried under the control, but there. Just stand still for a moment. She stood still. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed once, slowly, and when he looked up again, the rawness was mostly gone, but not entirely. Rough night? She asked. She said it the way she would say it to any table, neutral and professional, but she held his gaze when she said it, and she thought he knew the difference. I don't discuss my nights with waitstaff, he said. No, she agreed. You don't. She set his usual menu down. I'll give you a few minutes. She was halfway back to the service station when he said her name. She stopped. She turned. She hadn't told him her name. She was aware of that fact, clearly and calmly, the way she was aware of all facts, as data, as pieces of a picture. How do you know my name? She asked. I know things, he said. It's how I stay alive. She held his gaze from across the half-empty dining room. There was a long beat of silence in which the ambient sounds of the restaurant seemed very far away. Nora, she said. My name is Nora, and if you wanted to know, you could have just asked me. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite guilt. Something adjacent to it. I could have, he said. He didn't apologize. She hadn't expected him to. It happened on a Tuesday. The restaurant was at 3/4 capacity, which was the worst configuration. Busy enough that Nora couldn't afford to be slow, not busy enough that the dining room had the insulating noise of a full house. Cross had come in for the 6th week running and ordered the lamb, which had replaced the duck as his current preference since she had mentioned once, in passing, that the spring menu rotation was worth trying. He was with someone tonight. Not his men. They were in their usual positions, but an actual guest. A man in his 50s with the sort of face that came from decades of getting whatever he wanted, sitting across from Cross and speaking in the low, rapid rhythms of a negotiation. Nora kept her distance. She read the table in the way she read all tables, timing her check-ins, watching the water glasses, staying visible without intruding. She was at the service station when she heard it. The other man said, loudly enough to be heard from where she was standing, "Call the big girl over. I want to order." She did not react visibly. This was something she was extraordinarily practiced at. She crossed the floor. She took the man's order, a steak, extra well done, which told her something about his character. And she was turning to go when the man said, without lowering his voice, "Where do you find the discipline for this place? I'd lose my mind if the help looked like that." The table went still. Not slowly, immediately. The air changed quality the way it does before lightning, that pre-storm compression. Nora turned back. She was going to say something. She had a response ready, calm and pointed, the kind that left a mark without requiring a scene. She didn't get the chance. "Close your account," Cross said. The other man blinked. "What?" "With the logistics firm. Whatever you moved through our network last quarter, close the account. You'll receive the standard termination notice by morning." Cross lifted his bourbon And you'll leave now? The man stared at him. Evander, we were in the middle of something, Cross said. We're not anymore. A beat of absolute silence. The other man looked at Nora, then back at Cross. Then he stood up very slowly, with the particular stiffness of a man who was recalculating everything, and he left. Nora stood at the edge of the table and did not speak for a moment. You didn't have to do that, she said finally. No, Cross agreed. He looked at her steadily. But I was going to do it eventually anyway. He's been skimming from the account for 8 months. Tonight just settled the question of when. Nora held his gaze. So it wasn't about me. It was about both things, he said. They're not mutually exclusive. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had walked into her section and said something cruel and had been coming back every Thursday since. This man who knew her name without asking and ordered based on her recommendations, and had just ended a business relationship without any apparent difficulty, because someone had been rude to his server. I'll put in a separate check for the lamb, she said. You'll do no such thing, he said. She almost smiled. She didn't. Quite. She found the envelope in her coat pocket at the end of her shift. She didn't open it in the coat room. She walked the 12 blocks home first, in the November cold, with the envelope in her hand, and she stood in her kitchen under the fluorescent light and opened it there. Inside was a single card, no letterhead, and on it was written a number, her number, the one she used for work scheduling, and below it, in the same hand, 5 words. This doesn't have to be this. She read it twice. She put it on her kitchen table and made tea she didn't drink, and stood at the window looking at the street below. Nora Finch was not a woman who made decisions from sentiment. She was a woman who made decisions from data, from what she could see and measure and verify. And she had been measuring Evander Cross for 6 Thursdays, and what she had measured did not look like what she had expected to find. It looked like a man who was lonely in the specific, particular way of people who have made themselves powerful enough that no one will simply tell them the truth. She thought about the way he had looked on the 5th Thursday, with that fraying at the edge of his jaw. She thought about the way he ordered, based on her suggestions, without ever acknowledging that he was doing it. She thought about the fact that he had not apologized for the first night. Not once. And yet he had come back 6 times and tipped at a rate that suggested a complicated form of remorse. She did not call the number that night, but she kept the card. The following Tuesday, she was not working. She was at her kitchen table with her laptop and a spreadsheet that had nothing to do with Meridian Steakhouse, going through the publicly available financial filings of the Cross Logistics Group with the quiet, focused attention of a woman who had spent 6 years at Delvane and Associates, seeing what other people missed. She had started it as an exercise in professional habit, something to keep her eyes sharp, something to do with her hands. What she found made her stop. It wasn't dramatic. Dramatic things, in her experience, were almost always visible. It was subtle, a series of intercompany transfers that made sense individually and didn't make sense in aggregate, a pattern in the quarterly reconciliations that someone very good had worked very hard to obscure. Someone in Cross's organization was building a second set of books. Not skimming. Skimming was crude, personal, the move of someone who wanted money. This was structural. This was someone laying groundwork. She sat with the spreadsheet for 2 hours. She thought about how this was none of her business. She thought about how she was a server now, not a forensic accountant, and how the appropriate response was to close the laptop and go to bed. She thought about the envelope. This doesn't have to be this. She picked up her phone and typed a message to the number on the card. You have a problem in your Q3 intercompany reconciliations. Not skimming. Structural. Whoever's doing it is patient and has been at it for at least 2 years. She sent it before she could decide not to. 3 minutes passed. Her phone rang. She didn't go to him. He came to her. He showed up at her door 40 minutes later with no men visible, which she understood to mean there were men nearby. But he had decided, for reasons that were his own, to make this look like a choice between two people, rather than a security operation. She let him in. She poured him coffee, because that was what she had, and because she was, in her own home, in her own kitchen, not going to perform. He stood in her small kitchen in a coat that cost more than her monthly rent, and looked at her laptop on the table and then at her. "Walk me through it," he said. She sat down, and she walked him through it. She did not simplify. She did not soften. She used the terminology she had learned at Delvane, and she referenced the specific line items, and she showed him exactly what she had found, and exactly why it was a problem. He listened. He did not interrupt. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them demonstrating that his understanding of his own financial architecture was considerably more sophisticated than the picture his public filing suggested. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How did you find this?" he asked. "I'm good at seeing what people want to be invisible," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You were an accountant. I was a forensic accountant, and you're serving tables at Meridian. People end up in unexpected places," she said, and she said it without apology, and she held his gaze, and after a moment he nodded once, which she thought was the closest thing to understood she was likely to get from Evander Cross. "The person responsible," he said carefully, "is someone I trusted for 11 years. She absorbed that. She knew what it meant in his world to say something like that. She knew what 11 years of trust meant in a world where trust was the most dangerous currency. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it. He looked at her. A long look, the kind that landed somewhere different from all the other looks he'd given her. And then he said, quietly, "Why are you helping me?" She thought about lying. She thought about giving him something practical and clean, something about professional habit or idle curiosity. Instead, she said the thing that was actually true, because she was tired of giving people the convenient version. "Because I've been watching you for 6 weeks," she said. "And whatever you are, you're not what you're pretending to be in that dining room. And I don't like when things don't add up." Something shifted in the room, not dramatic, just a change in atmospheric pressure, the way it had changed in the restaurant on the first night, except pointed in the opposite direction. He set down the coffee mug. "I said something to you," he said. "The first night, in the restaurant." She waited. "I said it because you looked at me like I was an inconvenience," he said. "And I am not accustomed to being an inconvenience, and I wanted to see if I could make you flinch." A pause. "That's not an explanation. It's not an excuse. I know what it is." "What is it?" she asked. "Small," he said. "It was small of me." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it was." He held her gaze and did not look away. "Nora." He said her name differently than he had in the restaurant. "I've spent 11 years building something on the assumption that I knew exactly who was in the room. I was wrong about one of them. I may be wrong about others." He paused. "I'd like to not be wrong about you. You don't have any control over that," she said. "Being wrong about people doesn't work on a schedule." "No," he said. "But you can tell me if I'm getting you wrong." He looked at her steadily. "You've done it twice already, in the restaurant. Most people don't do it at all. Most people are afraid of you," she said. "And you're not." She thought about the first night, her hands shaking behind the service counter, the heat in her neck. "I didn't say that," she said. Something moved in his face. Something that hadn't been there before, in all the Thursdays at table 14. Something that looked, underneath everything he had trained himself to be, remarkably like relief. The man who had been building the second set of books was named Alden Murch, and he was Cross's head of operations, and Nora Finch never learned exactly what happened to him. She didn't ask. She understood, on a fundamental level, that there were rooms in Evander Cross's world that she was not meant to enter, and she had made her own decision about which rooms that applied to. What she did know was that the following Thursday, Cross arrived at Meridian at his usual time, and he sat at table 14. And when she came to the table, he looked at her directly and said, "I'd like to take you to dinner." She looked at him. "You are at dinner?" "Somewhere else," he said, "not as your customer." She considered this for a moment, in the way she considered most things, methodically, without performing the consideration out loud. "I'm working," she said. "I know. Saturday. I work Saturdays." "You're off Saturday," he said. "Garrett Sloane owes me something of a favor, as it happens." She stared at him. "You arranged my schedule. I'd like to take you to dinner," he said again, unrepentantly. "That," she said, "is an extremely aggressive way to ask someone out." "Yes," he agreed. He waited. Nora Finch stood at the edge of table 14 and looked at the man sitting across from her. This man, who had been cruel to her once, and had been coming back ever since, as if the cruelty had landed somewhere in his chest, and he couldn't get it out. This man who had ended a business partnership without blinking, because someone spoke about her in a way that wasn't acceptable. This man who had stood in her kitchen and called himself small, and meant it, and not tried to dress it up as something else. She thought about what she was, what she looked like, what the world had spent 31 years telling her those things meant for her odds. She thought about the fact that Evander Cross had never once, after that first night, treated her like a risk assessment. "Saturday," she said, "7 o'clock, and if you touch the reservation without telling me first, I will order the most expensive thing on the menu." Something happened to his face then that she had not seen before. It started at the corner of his mouth, and it was not polished, and it was not controlled, and it was, she realized with a start, a genuine smile. The kind that came from somewhere underneath the armor, the kind men like him spent years making sure no one witnessed. It suited him, she thought, more than the rest of it. 7 o'clock, he said. She turned to go. "Nora." She looked back. "The first night," he said, "I came back because you walked away." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. She walked back to the service station, and she allowed herself, just barely, in the small privacy of her own face turned away from the dining room, to smile.